Hey guys, welcome to MicroPodcast 1. I thought it'd be interesting to dig into one of the more popular and also most misunderstood controversies surrounding jiu-jitsu, which would be the concept of BJJ versus wrestling. So over the years, I've heard students, training partners, and even my own instructors debate the merits of BJJ and wrestling, and how athletes from these two different sports tend to match up. Take a second, go to YouTube and type in BJJ versus and see which search populates first. Everyone who trains at some point in their career has asked the question in one form or another, who wins, the BJJ guy or the wrestler? And as with so many arguments, this debate is essentially doomed from the onset, mainly because the question is so poorly worded and the terms are so poorly defined. My kids often tell me how annoying I am when answering questions. They'll ask, is golf a sport, or do you believe in God? And despite my best efforts to change, I will usually respond with something like, what do you mean by sport? And what do you mean by God? So if someone asks me, what's better, wrestling or jiu-jitsu, I suppose I'd have to respond with, better for what? I would first point this person to the BJJ Fanatics event that features the face-off between two world-class athletes, Gordon Ryan, who's of course representing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Pat Downey, who's representing wrestling. If you don't have time to YouTube it, I'll just summarize really quickly. So they compete in two matches back-to-back. The first is a 20-minute submission-only match, in which Gordon Ryan essentially toys with Pat Downey until the clock draws down. Then he takes his back, and Pat Downey taps sort of inexplicably from a power half Nelson. Sort of a strange finish, but Gordon was barely even warmed up after nearly 20 minutes. In match two, which took place under freestyle wrestling rules, Pat Downey wastes absolutely no time. He tech falls Gordon in something like under a minute. So in this case, both athletes were completely in control within the confines of their own rule set. Students of jiu-jitsu, specifically newer ones, seem to feel compelled to make this apples to oranges comparison between jiu-jitsu and wrestling. I think it's important to be clear that these are two separate sports with totally different rule sets and incentive structures. All things being equal, weight, athleticism, relative skill, the rule set will consistently dictate the winner. So for example, if I put together a match between your average high school senior folk style wrestler and your average 18-year-old BJJ blue belt, it seems obvious to me that the winner is going to be determined simply by the rule set under which they're competing. You know, folk style wrestling rules or standard IBJJF rules. So it seems simple enough. But at least for me, this isn't where the discussion ends. This debate is so much more interesting when viewed through the lens of mixed martial arts, a sport that has been absolutely central to my understanding of grappling since I first started. So let's travel back in time to 1993, McNichol Sports Arena, where Royce Gracie shocks the world by submitting his way through UFC 1 to become the first ever UFC champion. This event, which was framed as the first showcase of martial art versus martial art, was the understandable catalyst for the explosion of jiu-jitsu across the United States. But I also think it's important to note that there was not a single world-class wrestler on that fight card. As a person who absolutely considers wrestling to be a martial art, I don't think that this was an oversight or an accident by promoter Rorion Gracie, who is, of course, the brother of UFC 1 winner Royce Gracie. So let's time travel again, but this time back to UFC 60 in 2006, which was Matt Hughes versus Royce Gracie. Now, before I move forward, I'd like to be clear, this is not the BJJ versus wrestling comparison that I'm trying to make. Royce was smaller, older, and he was wildly unprepared for an MMA fight with UFC Hall of Famer Matt Hughes at this point in time. It wasn't a fair matchup. Understandably, Royce was taken down. He had his guard passed. He had his bag taken, and he was TKO'd via strikes in the first round. And again, this is not the relevant wrestling versus BJJ comparison that I want to make. I just want to be totally clear about that. But I do wonder at times if there had been a competent folk-style wrestler present at UFC 1, someone who was accomplished even on a regional level, would the result have been similar? I'm bringing us back to UFC 60 for a few reasons. First, this fight card was actually my introduction to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I did not care that Royce lost the fight to Matt Hughes. I saw the potential power and effectiveness of Jiu-Jitsu through his highlight reels that were playing during the pre-fight hype. I remember I'm standing in the middle of Buffalo Wild Wings, drinking a Rolling Rock, watching this totally unassuming guy submit his way through this very strange ensemble of fighters at the earlier UFC events. And I was just standing there falling in love with jiu-jitsu. I took my first class pretty soon after that. So I'm bringing it back to UFC 60 because of something essential, something that is core to my grappling philosophy that commentator Mike Goldberg said less than 30 seconds into round one. He said, Royce would love to get this down to the ground and try to use his submission power. But again, we wonder if he can do that unless Matt wants it to be there. Unless Matt wants it to be there. That's the power to dictate position. The folk-style wrestling rule set is totally built around the objective of forcing top position. The rules incentivize the study, the drilling, the perfection of techniques that will reliably put the athlete in top position. And because of this, I believe that wrestling is the single most effective base for mixed martial arts. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes are operating under a rule set that awards top position really only marginally, with 2 points. There's no riding time, and there are no points for reversing bottom to top. So if you're mounted and you reverse to top position, there's no reward or incentive for that. There is also no penalty for accepting bottom position, pulling guard, in most BJJ rule sets. So very often, jiu-jitsu athletes are training with very little incentive to win top position. Under a BJJ or submission grappling rule set, we actually can debate whether it's better to be on top or better to be on the bottom. It's debatable. With the absence of strikes, the athlete can sort of hang out on the bottom. They can lull their opponent, and they can gauge movement and build a strategy. But in the context of a mixed martial arts rule set, where your opponent can plant their feet and they can use kinetic energy to devastate with strikes from top position, it is objectively better to be on top. It's an absolute liability to be on the bottom. And the wrestler who has been training with the singular focus of imposing top position for their entire career is, on average, clearly better prepared for a mixed martial arts contest. And this is a difference that is deeply important to me. Should also note that MMA has evolved to the point where no athlete can successfully enter the sport with only one martial arts skill set. Everyone learns how to kickbox. Everyone knows how to wrestle. Everyone understands submissions. And the athletes are becoming just more and more adept at combining all three of these as the years pass. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was once billed as the single best standalone martial art. It was all you'll ever need to learn. And while I don't think that could ever really be true, I think that we could shift our sport a bit closer to that objective. Remembering what made Jiu-Jitsu great in the first place, like those landmark victories in the early UFCs, is still relevant today. We have a problem of incentives. I really have no aspirations whatsoever to be a tournament promoter. I'm looking to the leaders, the IBJJF, ADCC, WNO, EBI, and I'm waiting for someone to emerge with a rule set that helps Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu start to resemble a combat sport a bit more. Building rules that incentivize top position would have the following compounding effects on the sport. It will encourage the training of throws, takedowns, and other technical sequences that are going to land you in top position. I think because of that, it's also going to push the evolution of even more aggressive guard tactics. Because of those two things, I think it's going to solidify Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a complete standalone martial art, or at least get us closer to that point. Those things are going to funnel even more athletes into professional mixed martial arts, more jiu-jitsu athletes. And finally, because of that, the prevalence of BJJ as a legit base in MMA is going to grow the popularity of BJJ as an activity for your average person. So I think some change in the incentive structure is just going to be good all around. So I guess the last thing I'd like to say is that I do not wish for this podcast to have a sort of like kids these days vibe. I am truly impressed with the evolution of the latest generation of grapplers. And I've always had a very heavy skepticism when it comes to respecting tradition simply for tradition's sake. In an ideal world, we would keep the innovations of modern grappling, like the unbelievable power of the modern leg lock game, the ability to hunt the back through these dizzying, crab ride and twister hook inversions, while throwing away the just absolute level 10 cringe of sustained double guard pulls and 50-50 seesawing. This is my vision for the future of my school. Thanks for listening.